Hello, everyone. I'm so sorry that I cannot be with you in person, but thankfully, technology allows me to address you. My name is Lena Dominelli. I'm a professor of social work at the University of Stirling in Scotland, and I'm director of the MSc in Disaster Interventions and Humanitarian Aid. I have been working on disaster interventions and humanitarian aid now since the 2004 tsunami. And then I've moved on to look at all kinds of disasters, including earthquakes, floods, droughts, heat waves, and COVID, to name but a few. What I'm going to talk about today, because I could talk about this topic and any element of it for hours on end, and hopefully not bore you, but you never know. I have to say I've been talking too much, and my voice is getting very dry, so do excuse me when I have to have a sip of my water. But what I'm going to talk about today is about a topic that is invisible and visible at the same time in all disasters. And that's why I've gone a bit beyond some of the things I say in the chapter and in the shadows. And I have to congratulate Baswa for giving us the opportunity to put that book together. So thank you, Maris and Angie, for editing it. But I'm going to focus on masculinity and men in war, prompted really by the Ukrainian crisis, because I've been supporting social workers there since the 24th of February. And I'm going to look at the violence that men perpetuate against women during disasters, which goes up in a hockey curve. So you know what a hockey stick looks like? Well, that's how it goes up like that. Really quite enormous increase in violence of various types, including rape, sexual assault, physical assault, and I don't even know how to count these, but they're all embedded in attacks against women and their bodies. And that includes their minds and the emotions, as well as their physical being. And one of these is shaving women's heads. So I'm going to try and look at this in terms of what are men doing and why are they doing this? And I look at men's roles as violators of women's bodily integrity, providers of economic support, at least in theory, for women, and also in theory, men's roles as protectors, and how disasters exacerbate feelings of insecurity and inadequacy in men in their roles as providers and protectors. And basically, they take it off against women, children, and other men who they see as being less powerful than they. So we have a weapon or a weaponization of women's bodies, because women's bodies in many societies represent the nation. They are charged with raising the children, which means responsible for future generations, for nurturing, caring for everybody in the family, extended families, and all the rest of it. And so our cultural dialogues, and this is, there are some exceptions, of course, in every society. This is the dominant hegemonic model that I'm talking about. And the purpose of attacking women's bodies, because they're supposed to symbolize the purity of the nation, the goodness of the nation, all the positive things that we associate with the nation: nurturing, caring, fairness, inclusivity, relationships, connectedness, all of those things. So why then, if men are supposed to be nurturing and protecting women, do they not? And especially in war, why have they weaponized women's bodies and attack women deliberately to humiliate and bring shame upon both men and women? The women experience the shame directly and the men indirectly, because when a woman who is in a relationship with a man, any kind of relationship, whether it's daughter, um, wife, friend, any kind of relationship, it brings humiliation to the woman directly, but also humiliation and shame to the man and therefore the society, because the men are seen as having failed in their role as protectors of women and children. But I'm going to focus on women because of the lack of time. Also, it is an important instrument in ethnic cleansing. Rape, particularly, because it means that if a woman gets pregnant, she is going to have passing on the genes of the man to the child. And a lot of societies will not recognize either the woman or the child after this happens, even though the woman was completely blameless in the situation. And so another way of viewing it is to see it as patriarchal relations of men's dominance over women, regardless of their resistance to aggression. And women do resist attacks on them, but usually they become overpowered by the men. And yet society, this has been going on since the year dot, but society has ignored it and has very little to say about this. And it's been mainly feminist work in and around disaster situation that has highlighted this. The first group of women to do this were Betty Morrow and Elaine Enerson around Hurricane Andrew in the USA. In 1991. So it goes back a while. And they highlighted how women's experiences of all these attacks on their bodies were basically invisible. And it was there before the disaster. It got worse during the disaster, and it carried on getting worse. But the only ones who were made to feel guilty about what was going on were the women. Why? Why are women made to feel guilty for something that has been perpetrated against them? I'm sure the Ukrainians are asking the same question about why are they fighting a war that they did not begin? And in a way, a counselor in some research done by Parkinson and Zara in Australia around the bushfires in 2013 have said, you have to ask, what is behind family violence? If it's a traumatic state of mind, that would determine how it would be dealt with, rather than labeling the behavior as abusive. You may find workers have changed the definition of family violence to accommodate the emotional and psychological conditions women are experiencing. So they are saying basically the physical and sexual attacks on women produce emotional and psychosocial, psychological responses which are ignored. They become invisible. And in war, men are the aggressors, but the women are asked to keep quiet about what happens to them so that they can fight and live on as a united community, with the understanding that they will either survive together as a community of men and women and children, or not at all. And therefore, that is one of the key reasons for women's invisibility and the silence around the attacks on them. It reinforces patriarchal relations, of course, and most humanitarian aid workers are very reluctant to engage in any kind of changes to existing social relations on the grounds that cultural issues have to be recognized. But what happens to women in wars and when they're attacked, especially sexually and physically assaulted during war, is that they lose their social roles, Communities don't want to acknowledge their existence if they've been raped, by and large. There are, of course, lots of women's groups, especially feminist groups, that come to the support of women in these situations. And there are wonderful people like Monica Hauser, for example, in Germany, who has been working on this since the Bosnia-Herzegovina war. So look up her work because it's very important. But basically, what feminists have done is to work with women to either reduce or eliminate the trauma that they're experiencing, to empower women to take up their lives, even if it is in a community other than the one that they were raised and brought up in. And that is why we argue that the impact of trauma produced by war situations, including the attacks on women, have a greater impact on women. Because if women are kicked out of their communities, they will experience homelessness, unemployment, loss of income and housing, great feelings of shame because they've lost their role in society and they've lost their status within their community. It can lead to increased alcohol and drug use, but if women have children, they tend not to. They sacrifice their own futures to look after the children that they didn't even initially want or prepare for or expect. They are constantly living in a situation of fear. There's not enough safety for them, whether they're in camps or whether they're in communities that are outside of the war zone. They're still not sure that they're not going to be followed by some people in the community from their former community, especially in some communities where the shame and the humiliation that women are seen, so the women get blamed, they're seen as bringing shame onto the community, and there has to be a punishment of the woman, even though she had nothing to do with causing the situation to begin with. So there's always that fear, is someone going to follow me to wherever I've sought sanctuary and safety? And there's a loss of the sense of certainty about who you are, your identity, where you belong in society as well. And often this can lead to a loss of sense of self, like you don't know who you are anymore because you've been thrown out of your community, or people will go around some other way not to have to come across you because they feel ashamed, they feel guilty, and they feel humiliated, especially other women. And especially if they've seen you being humiliated, like, for example, with head shaving of women, especially if they have long, beautiful hair, because that's associated with being feminine and beauty and all the aesthetics of womanhood and femininity. And if they've been shaved publicly, and this has happened a lot, including in Western countries like Spain and France, and there's a wonderful PhD written by Charlotte Walmsley in Scotland that talks about this, then the humiliation and the guilt at not doing anything about stopping this from happening affects everyone, not just the women who've been the victim survivors of the shaving. And also in France and in Spain, women who were being shaved and forced to walk down their streets with their shaven heads were given laxatives before they started off, to bring further shame and humiliation upon them, especially if they couldn't control their bowel movements. And again, you know, these laxatives would be forced down their throats, and some of them were pretty horrendous, like castor oil and stuff like that. So it's really important, I think, that we look at these issues because they've been ignored for so long. And we have to understand why men engage in such action, because they are trying to live up to the ideals, so-called, of masculinity, which are that men in war must be heroes. But the pressures on men to be heroes when they cannot, and you know, Ukraine is a good example of that. Russian soldiers, as well as I understand some Ukrainian soldiers as well, have raped women in large numbers, the Russians, particularly as part of their misogynistic views, but also their miscegenation views. And they will try to attack other men whom they then show up to have failed in their protector roles. And yet the women, interestingly enough, if it's happening within the same community, and some people would argue, like the Russians certainly have, these women that they're raping are Slav women, like the Russians are Slavic ethnic groups as well. And yet they're being attacked by the people who they share lots of cultural and ethnic traits with. But when we look at some research, now the research on Ukraine has still to be done, but in Australia, the women start sympathizing with the men. And often they will sympathize more with the men because they understand the shame that the men feel than they do the women. And again, Emma in Parkinson and Zara has said, these men who have violated us, we have to understand the situation because they're professional firefighters. It was their job to stop the unstoppable, that is the massive fires that they could do nothing about. They bear the grief and the loss and the guilt, and they had all those people die, and we knew them all, and they feel they failed. So they have failed in their protector role, very clear. And women support the men as part of gendered patriarchal relations. But what the women say, which I think is very interesting, we want the violence against us to stop, but we're not going to stop supporting our men, which is part of gendered patriarchal relations. And here's an example. This one comes from my own research in Sri Lanka during the tsunami, where a woman who was really being used and abused, not just physically, sexually, but financially. Every penny she earned was taken by the man who then used it to get drunk on arak. She said, I did not want to work in that factory. I wanted to be a teacher. He lost his fishing boat and only I could work in that factory because she hadn't trained to be a teacher yet. He would come home drunk and angry and take it out on me, but no one wanted to help. So it is really quite dire, the situation that all of these failures that men have are dumped on women through violence, and then the men get a lot more of the sympathy and responses than the women do. However, there is one thing that I think that men do when they lose their provider role or their protector role. It changes their perceptions even of themselves. And women who've been assaulted by men that they've been in relationships with before the war started and never, ever had a finger laid on them are telling us they do now. During the war and afterwards, they have been, or during the disaster and after the disaster, they have been physically abused, assaulted sexually, and everything else. And some women, if they have the options, but a lot don't, will put restraining orders on them. In Australia, of course, they do. Women do have recourse to feminist support and the law. And so they did. But another woman said, I'm seeing this side of him I never knew. I just didn't know what to expect. He's not the husband that I met and loved for so long. And another woman puts it even more graphically. Michelle says, I don't know what's going on with my husband, but he's not the person I married. That person has disappeared. And so what we find is that men's role as provider, which is part of that hegemonic binary of gendered patriarchal relations, is that being the provider, being the protector, puts men in a position of power over women. And when men cannot fulfill that role, they then attack the woman. But here's what another man said about when I was asking him, what do you think about men abusing women? And he said, well, middle-aged men had lots of drawbacks because they lost their employment. They have to restart their life again, but they have to find the money to care for their family, for the children to go to school. And they don't know any job other than fishing. Starting something new is not easy. Men are used to alcohol, and with the money that they got from aid, actually, men's consumption of alcohol became high. So they blame the alcohol, not men's failure to control their emotions, their behavior, to seek help from the professional services that are available in many situations, or even informal services from others. They don't look at any of those things. It's just kind of like, well, we have to make exceptions for the men because they've had a tough time and they don't know how to deal with it. But the women, on the other hand, are expected to carry on and pretend that nothing has happened. So here's another, again, this is a man saying this. The men are trying to do something, but they are helpless because it's not their fault that everything has been destroyed and they're not doing anything. Again, sort of saying they're failing to meet their provider role. However, it goes on to say, women are not excused by society. They are supposed to solve whatever problems they face and take care of the household and the children. And as we heard from before, during that same research project, the women are expected to find jobs because it's easier for them to do that. And I would add that NGOs and other forms of responding to women, they respond to women more than men. And so a lot, and I've done this, my first kind of aim is to get women a source of income that they can then use to feed their families, empower themselves, empower their children. And so what do? You look for income generation posts, and that gets the women going. But then, as we heard before, often the money goes to the men. But I do have examples in Sri Lanka where the women that we helped became empowered and said to the men, we're keeping our money, but this was a group. So if you can get women to act as a group instead of individuals, like the one I quoted in Sri Lanka, they will then work together and empower one another. So this was another group in Sri Lanka. The women got together, they made money because they were making and selling food and vegetables and prepared foods to other people. And they said to the men, we're going to Kandy because we wanted to go to the Temple of the Tooth for God knows how many years. And so we are going to go there now without you guys. It's just going to be the Women's Day out. And off they went to Kandy, which is a town not where they lived, nearby. They hired a bus, got everything organized themselves, paid for it themselves because they had the money from their income generation project. And meanwhile, the men were sitting at home doing very little. So we do need to look at what can we do for men. Getting them to work, I think, is most important, even though I say it with some reluctance, because that means we're reinforcing patriarchal relations. But I keep saying to myself, it's not my job to change societal relations with people who've just gone through a disaster. That's up to the women and the men who live in those societies. I can only empower people by providing them with whatever opportunities I can to rebuild their lives in the way they want. But there are things that we can do to reduce the violence against women. And we do need to do a lot more research, but if women can work as groups of women, then those groups of women will go. If a woman complains that a partner or a husband, usually it's a husband, has been beating them up, the women will grow as a group to say, don't you do this again to her, because you'll have all of us to answer to. And that has reduced it in many situations and different countries as well. So empowering women through income generation projects like the one I cited just before, means that you give women a sense of knowing their rights, that they are entitled to rights, that they are entitled to violence-free spaces, that they are entitled to services, to look after themselves, and to do what they think they need without having to engage them in any discussions about changing their society, because women will empower themselves by working with other women. And that's the way it should be. Those women they work with are women from their community, women they know, women they trust, not outsiders, humanitarian aid workers who can be seen as kind of abusing their power because they have aid money to distribute and also jobs to provide for people. The other thing that I think we need to do is to engage men in dialogues about their unrealistic expectations around their socially constructed roles. And this is where getting men in groups with other men is really important, because we have to get them to restory their narratives and stop thinking that, oh, I was always a good fisherman and therefore I need a boat and I want a boat now, and then I'll go out and fish and do everything as normal, including beating up the women. We have to say to them, look, you can survive. We'll help you survive. Maybe we won't be able to get you a boat because we couldn't get boats for everyone that needed them, not least because some guys said they had lost their boat when they hadn't. But not all people who needed a boat got one. And women weren't allowed to get boats, even though they wanted them, because they'd lost their husbands and sons out to the sea. But we can restory their narratives about how, if they get new opportunities, they can start thinking about changing their lives to value women's contributions to their family, to their extended family, to their communities, and to see them as partners, egalitarian partners in those relationships. The other thing I think we have to do is consciousness raise and educate men about their abusive behavior and say to them, women are suffering, even if they're not telling you anything about this. And here's evidence that we have. Of course, we don't say who told us that. So we know how many women have been suffering in this community. And then the other thing I think we need to do is to make sure that we give them income generation opportunities, because it does reduce, even if it brings it down to the levels of violence and abuse of women pre the disaster, it will mean a huge reduction in that hockey curve. And we do have to engage men in thinking about seeking alternatives to violence when they disagree with whatever society has produced or thrown at them, including a disaster which has denied them of their livelihoods. Because being deprived of your livelihoods does not justify attacking women, children, and other people, and using that to exploit them and to humiliate them so that you can feel better about yourself as a man. And that's it. Thank you very much. I don't know what happens to the questions here, but I would have loved to have given you the opportunity to ask me questions. But since I cannot, I do have in this last slide my email address. And if you want to ask me any questions, do feel free to email me. And once again, I just say thank you for listening. And I hope you have a wonderful time listening to the other speakers. Thank you so much for your attention. Bye for now.